Good evening and welcome to the second of a four-part series looking at the Vitality Women's FA Cup. So on Monday night, we looked at practice design in possession. Tonight, we're going to flip it out of possession. So we're going to look at defending the goal. I'm joined by myself, Matthew Ramsbotham, Game Insights Analyst at the FA. We've got Kelsey Byrne, who's a Women's National Coach Developer. We've got Claire McDougall-Robinson, who's a Women's High Performance Centre Coach Development Officer. And in our chat box tonight, we've got Martin Dighton, who's a Women's and Girls Coach Development Officer. So he can answer any questions across the game in terms of grassroots football. So we've got a nice spread across the game tonight to really delve into detail about what we're going to discuss. So we're going to recap some of the data from Monday night and take it on another level in terms of how we look to prevent goal scoring opportunities, especially within the defensive third. So this data comes from last season's WSL that's been coded bespoke by us at the FA. Kelsey, we're then going to take it on into more of a coach development setting.
Yeah, so we're just going to start to identify some key messages from the data, quite similar to on Monday night, and starting to think about the implications then on practice design. We are looking more with some tactical lens this time rather than just technical, and there will be quite a lot of things thrown at you to consider and around practice design. So there'll be probably more quantity this time, but then to think about how that might actually look in your own practice. And then we're going to actually just start to have a look at building a little bit of a practice and how we might apply that to different practices, utilising the FA Cup case study example again, utilising Manchester City and Everton. But again, it will be quite generic to allow people to apply that to their own context, whether that's very limited numbers, very limited pitch size, large numbers. So hopefully it should be applicable to everybody.
Wonderful. So some of the headlines that was presented on Monday night in terms of almost trying to map out the landscape of how goals are scored, and in tonight's case, how goals are conceded. Real key message was the 72% of goals scored from open play. So that makes 187 goals across the WSL. And then we really tried to highlight how the game's evolving and developing in terms of more goals scored in each game, especially this season. So some of the messages we'll talk about tonight are even more important when there's more goals, more action within both penalty areas. Martin's put some comments in the chat about how this would look for your players in your leagues and the teams you coach. So start to consider some of this as we work through tonight.
Okay, and I think they're just adding on to that. That is around just how can we utilise the data, and what we've tried to do is utilise the data from scoring goals and what we know about scoring goals to try and flip it on its head to start to think about how can we then prevent goals. So utilising what we found to start to think about how might we prevent. And I thought a really good way of starting this would be to look at it from a holistic perspective around defending, and what defending will mean in the context of the game itself, and then go narrower after that. So we looked at some tactical considerations and we started to think about when a goal scored and what effect that has on the outcome of the game. So we found that 73% of the time, if you score the first goal, you'll win the game. And that's quite a big consideration when thinking about goal scoring, but also about when you're thinking about defending. How will that look? And what's the ranking of importance to defending versus attacking when considering that percentage? And so what does that implication have on your pre-game strategy? How you might look to be? And then we brought that down even further into then the first half. So 82% of the first goal scored was in the first half. And then to break that down even further, 46% of those goals were then in the first 15 minutes. So again, what does that do to your pre-game strategy? What's getting you to think about in regards to defending and its importance, especially within that first 15 minutes? And I think a consideration for me, especially when looking at that, is the way we structure practices. So I think I see predominantly, I'm not sure if this is the same for you, Claire, that when we go into clubs, it's, quite a similar structure. When we're looking at defending or we're looking at emergency defending, we're looking at goal scoring, that we'll start with warm-up, we'll start with technical practice, and we'll start to build up the intensity throughout the session. When we get to then the real end bit of the session where the game is live, it's high intensity, and we're probably about 30, 40 minutes away from finishing the session. Whereas this is actually saying that first 15 minutes is really crucial and important to winning the game. So how can we start to think about switching players on earlier, in the earlier periods of games and the earlier periods of training, and start to replicate that? So we've got a bit of a consideration around that when we started to build later on in the webinar. But I think that's a really interesting point and statistic. Is there anything to add on to that, Claire?
No, I think it's a really good point, isn't it? Where, habits of coaches where we say that last goal wins, but it's not. It's that first important one. So we need to maybe consider around our match day prep in terms of warm-up. So making sure that they're ready and they understand their strategies and their roles and responsibilities. Because as an in-possession focus, we want to score that first goal, but thinking and mindful of the defenders, we've got to be understanding of what we need to be doing. So it's really important that we have to be switched on, and it's really quite key. That has to be early within the session. So what are we doing as coaches to manage that environment to help get that out, which would be really good.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll look to just build on this as we go through. So we'll show, especially in a one-off game like an FA Cup final, how this will be even more important, and how actually Man City have really used this to their advantage over the season. So we'll start to tie in some of them considerations. So just to build on some of the England DNA, you'll probably be familiar with across the 5 lanes. So the graph on the left is where goals are scored from. You can see a predominance central. No surprise, the closest to the goal, higher chance of scoring. And then on the right-hand side, you can see where the build-up comes from. So where does the assist location? And you can actually see it, and more and even spread, predominantly down in the wide areas and then playing centrally. You can see a little 9% in your own half. So it shows build-up from deeper, that maybe ball beyond or in behind the opposition. So there is a nice spread across the pitch, and we'll start to tie in some of these considerations as we move through. So then if we take it on into a deeper dive, so that's more general. This is now zooming into these zones. And on Monday night, we showed about the importance of that second 6-yard box in terms of goal scoring. Tonight we can show some data on the assist location and how that feeds into where you get into advanced areas of the pitch. So I'm just going to throw it over to you in terms of what does this mean for you and your players? What areas are a key priority to look to defend? Kelsey, I don't know if you've got any initial thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's again kind of referring back to Monday night. There's some key areas there that you would look to defend, and I don't think it's a shock to anyone around the central areas of the goal. But it's still, that's where goals are scored from. So we're still saying that actually centrally we're still not defending as well as we would like, and especially when we start to look at the 2 comparisons between Man City and Everton, that will start to come to life a little bit more really, and starting to think about what does that mean from a practice design. And if we start to think about games are won and lost in both 18-yard boxes, and how much time do we spend outside of those in practices, I think we do quite a lot. Or on the flip side, we start to think about playing out from the back or a high press rather than that low block emergency defending versus the finishing the attack. So I think it's really interesting to think about what that means for planning of sessions, for structuring sessions, for periodization of cycles for players, and how we build up to this point, and how much emphasis we put on it really in our practice, and in what we serve up to the players on a daily or weekly basis. Claire, anything from you?
Yeah, I mean, just linking back to Monday when obviously we looked at Chloe Kelly and looking at those assist locations out wide areas, that inverted winger. So are we so if I work alongside a pathway coach, are we trying to help our defenders understand what that means. So not only is it a single 1v1 and how that I need to defend and what strategy I need to put to it, but then linking it across to the unit and then to the secondary units as well. So we need to make sure that our practices reflect what they're going to come up against, but also the tool sets that they're going to need. And I think in Mindful, we've got to be looking at the data is now, and it's going to move on in years to come. So obviously we've got to keep that in our foresight with it. But it is current information. If we're looking at those types of players that we need to come up against, we need to help them to work it out. So again, our practice design around pitch geography is really important. And if we're lucky enough to be able to move the areas and move our sessions in the correct areas of the pitch to help them to be relative to see those pictures in terms of distances, angles, relation to where the goal is, relation to where it is around that 18-yard box. And then as we link to other players, which we'll come into a little bit later, it's really important that we can kind of do that, if you can, with our varying venues that we might use on a weeknight to help each other out.
Yeah, and that's our hope by the end of tonight, that the coach will lead this webinar with some greater consideration around some of these things and how they can work with their players to just make it their practices look more like the game. So if they go away with nothing more than that tonight, we've done our job. So just to take it on into sort of some deeper dive into actually defending. So we're going to introduce the concept of shot packing. I've put a visual there. So Arsenal are in possession. Jordan Nobbs just stroked the ball there, and we can highlight 4 players in the way. So if we basically take a triangle from where the ball contact is, take it to both of the posts, and draw a triangle. It's how many players, how many bodies are in the way of that shot. And we do include the goalkeeper. So I'm just going to take on a second angle just to help visualize this a bit better. So there's four players in the way. You can just see that player on the left-hand side is just out of the shot because it goes to the post in a triangle. So there's 4 players that could impact on where the location of that shot goes. So I'm just going to bring you in, Kelsey, on that first image, some of your observations and thoughts from what you see.
Yeah, I think probably the main message from this picture in particular is just that it just highlights the demands of the game inside that box, the closeness of players, the distance. So if we start to think about the distance away from the ball, the distance away from each other, I think that's really important. And I think we're going to highlight that a little bit later on in the webinar in regards to pressure and what that looks like. But I think, the demands of defending inside that 18-yard box and the prioritising of bodies. Where do we put bodies? And when we look at shot packing, how many bodies? What do we want that to look like? And how do we prioritise, 1, the ball, so Jordan on the ball, but 2, the other threats inside the 18. So are we getting pressure on the ball? Are we covering the goal? But also, what about the other threats? So you've got 2 other bodies in there that are potential threats that we also need to deal with. So it's starting to think about not just on the ball, but away from the ball and what's happening in and around the ball at that moment in time.
And Claire, I know you've got some observations from a goalkeeper's perspective on this, just from the shot and sort of implications on them.
Yeah, so not only are we now looking at the numbers, but we're probably looking at where they're positioned. So if we can see there, the keeper hasn't really got a clear viewpoint. So it's really important about then the position of where they are and then relative. So she's not really going to have much time to react. So that's really important about how that. So Kelsey's mentioned about where they need to be, but actually they're going to cover the point where the keeper can't actually do anything or has a really late timing of actually to react to it in any realistic terms. So if that's a real good, clear picture there, we can see she's probably struggling even to try and see it without even their player who's probably standing in the way in addition to that.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also a really good point to highlight on that as well. Just the positioning of that first contact player. So the player that's gone to initially try and press the ball and looking at her body shape. So she's obviously gone leg up to try and block the shot, but then her arms as well. We need to start to think about the rules and imply the rules of the game. and really get the players to think about when we're doing this, the rules of the game and the implications of doing that and stopping shots with that body shape. And I think that's really important that we don't lose sight of that and the realism of that when we're doing defending in practices, and we make sure we give the relevant consequences of doing stuff like that, and if it is a handball, etc. So I think that's really interesting, the body shape of that first defender.
We just got the video of this just to further sort of interrogate and actually see the outcome of this. So we just left a little bit of build-up play so you can see where it comes from. It's Arsenal versus Brighton Hove Albion. So we're going to slow it down now for the replay.
I think what's really important to highlight on this as well is the importance of the second phase. So we spoke quite a lot just so far on that real first phase and what that looks like, but then the reaction of the second phase. And I think if we start to speak about mentality of defending, I think bravery in the mentality of defending and the side corner is massive. And if you don't have that, and the bravery and the psychological aspects to go after players and be aggressive and put bodies in the way, in the first phase and the second phase, that's where you're leaving yourself open a little bit. And I think just wanted to kind of showcase really two clear pictures that bring to life some of the stuff that myself and Claire spoke about before the video and then in the video itself. But you can see there just a little bit of a highlight of the two players that have got themselves back in goal side, but their body shape, and how that then restricts them from being able to then apply pressure in the second phase when it comes out. So how often do we talk about and where is our focus and our observation of players to getting in the body shape and the body angles, but how much do we do with the MDT team and the physical performance coaches around being able to change body positions quickly, footwork, foot patterning, being able to change direction of planting off one foot to get to the other foot to be able to deal with the second phase quick enough that we can get pressure on that ball. I think that's really important. And then we start to think about the second picture there, again, just highlighting that first defender and the body shape. But also, if you can see from picture 1 to picture 2, how the player's gone from quite a good position in order to be able to affect that back post and support the goalkeeper in shot packing the goal, to then moving into sight of the goalkeeper. Was that done consciously, or was that just done watching the ball, following the ball, trying to have an effect on the ball? And I think that's where we can affect players' decisions and really attach them to the why and why it's important to cover as much of the goal as possible, and the effect that they might have on losing focus and just following the ball and trying to be on the initial contact rather than supporting the next phase of that. I don't know if you've got anything on that, Claire, from watching the video and looking at the pictures.
Yeah, I mean, we want enthusiastic defending, don't we? And I think we praise the initial, probably that, psych element of going to do it, but then the over-enthusiasm of not understanding their role, and it's discipline, isn't it, then, to understand what they need to then do. And that's usually then it caused the problem. Really could have went then through her leg and the keeper's leg to then score on the goal, which we probably can see, be mindful of it, just literally from it. So an initial great position to then, just reading what you've said, Kelsey, there, but just getting to understand. It's really important about the how, when and the where, but then understanding why they're doing it. And then that should be really important for them to understand, and then they should know what their role is.
Mm-hmm. And I think as well, just adding on to that, just as a coach, is sort of what are we observing when these practices are going on, when the game's going on? How much are we looking on the ball, but then how much are we looking away from the ball and starting to think about body positions, foot patterning, footwork, how players are positioned, where they're positioned, the timing of the getting into that position. And I'm not sure that we have that narrow focus all the time. We have quite a tactical lens and we look at it from the bigger picture, but how to really home in and think about what do my players need, what are the players' needs right now, and how can I support them in understanding the context of the game a little bit better by across all four corners.
And there's comments from the chat coming in about it's almost a subconscious movement just to stop the shot, isn't it? So I know we touched on the sort of mentality and sensing danger, recognising it. And Martin sort of asked that question for us in terms of actually how do you do this with your players? Are your players aware of it in the first place? And then actually how do you embed it within your practices? Do you have a strategy for it? Is it something you plan for? Is there certain zones and areas you cover? So there's all these considerations that we're trying to get you to think about. Mm-hmm. Claire?
I was just saying it takes time for us to practice that as well, because it's a skill set as a coach to observe. So there's no harm in, this now that we do tend to start looking at the ball, but it's the practice about that lens away from it. And it just takes a little bit of time. So when you are watching practices and or games, it might be say, okay, the next 2 to 5 minutes, I'm going to watch away from the ball. I'm going to have a specific focus. So can you challenge yourself at times to do that and just give you that experience to kind of looking at it, because we, naturally we'll always look at the ball. So was that picked up? So if you honestly reflected that video, and if we do have video footage, which is nice at times, but sometimes we don't, and it's always live game, so we have to develop that skill set. But did you see that? Did you see where that player had come from? And if you don't, that's fine, but we just got to go and practice, and that's what we can help you out with.
Yeah, and so my background in analysis is how do you get your players to be just more aware and like you say, develop them observational skills so they can start to try out things that might be more effective. It's not just as easy as getting more players in the way. You stop the shot. There's actually got to be some thought behind it. Mm-hmm. We'll take that on now into actually how many players in the way. So along the bottom, this is how many additional defenders are in the way of the shot. So the goalkeeper's assumed it's how many additional defenders. So we've said 3 or more players in the way of the shot. Actually, there's only 25% of goals scored that way. So we're suggesting the more players you get in the way of the goal frame, fill the frame, you've got a better chance of stopping conceding. Probably common sense. So we're just trying to sort of delve into this data. So actually 0 happens infrequently because you've either rounded the keeper and you've got a clear sight of goal. 1 happens as quite a lot. So there's 84 instances, 84 goals that happen that way. And then as you build the picture up, obviously, more defenders in the way, better chance of stopping the shot. So then just to take it on again, the average number of players in the way is 1.8. So we're talking in around two additional players in the way. And the graph at the bottom is actually how many touches and then how many players in the way. So the key message for us is the more you delay the opposition, the more players you can get in the way. So as the touches increase, the more players that can get in the line of the sight of the shot in the goal frame increases. So for us, it's a real good strategy if we're thinking defensively. Delay the opposition, it allows us to get more bodies in the way of the shot. We've just shown that increases our likelihood of not conceding goals. So actually, we said this earlier in terms of it's not just filling areas. You actually have to try and apply pressure on the ball. So we're now just going to go into a discussion around the impact of pressure and how that can affect the strikers in this case. Just before we go into the video, Kelsey, we said that the average number of players applying direct pressure or indirect pressure is around 1. Mm-hmm. The video will start to describe the differences. So we've said direct pressure is with players in around a metre. So they can actually tackle them, they can put pressure on them, they can block. Indirect, we're saying, can block the shot from distance. So would be classed in that shot packing radius. And then unopposed is just there's no pressure on the ball, they've got a free shot. So the video will obviously bring this to life. As you're watching, just put some of your comments of what you see in the chat. So hopefully that video is brought to life. So just to recap, direct pressure within a metre, so can apply contact, can make tackles, can stop the shot. Indirect, looking to block the shot, so will be classed in that shot packing ring. And then unopposed is no pressure on the ball at all. Kelsey, initial observations on that video?
I think my thoughts on that is just around pressure itself, and so linking back to the conversation we just had around shot packing. When does you release a player from the pack to go and press? Where do you do that? Where's the priority areas to do that? What's the implications of doing that outside the width of the goals? So is that going to help and support your defending, or is it actually going to hinder and take players out of the pack? And just really starting to think about, what is the pressure for? Is that to commit to win, an intent to win? Is it to prevent, or is it to spoil play? So is it just to try and get a foot on it, a knee on it, a little bit of a deflection on it? Is it trying to actually win the ball back, or is it to prevent something, prevent the shot, prevent the forward pass, prevent the ball going somewhere else? And then starting to just think about, how can I utilise my body in them instances? So if it's the indirect, what does my body look like to ensure that it complies with the rules of the game? So if you think about the previous picture we looked at, but then also if I'm talking about direct pressure, and I'm in and around the ball, how can I utilise my body as a defender to really utilise my body and limbs, get across players, not allow them that easy shot? And we spoke about on Monday night, that first time finish, and how important that is, being able to get across the front. But the subtle art of the nudge. So as the ball's coming in and the players just took their eye off and just starting to now watch the ball coming in, and I'm now on one leg ready to strike, that little nudge, the little touches that they're just taking them off balance slightly. And it's not the bit of committing fouls, it's not the bit of going too far. It's just, when do I make contact? How long do I make contact for? Where can I make contact? And starting to think about those little fine arts of being able to utilise my body. And do we teach and promote and allow players to experiment with this body contact? Is it a get up there, show, delay, being around the ball, but not actually go and go with an intent to win, utilise my body? How do I utilise my body? What's my strongest stance for me as a player? Where am I the strongest, and how can I utilise that against another opponent? And it's just that outwitting of opponents, that 1v1 outwitting of opponent stuff. Claire, have you got anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I think it's a good job this is getting recorded, because some really good detail there, Kelsey, on one term that people might just thought pressure is just something one to do. But I think if we're looking at in terms of development of players at younger age groups, I think we have to be realistic in their expectations. And I think as coaches, we need to try and get them to find about themselves, and players knowing about themselves. There's a lot of their knowing about, which foot will I use? Can I try to use both? Well, maybe not. So, as I'm building my strength and my force, and as I'm growing and developing, we have to be realistic about our expectations of what players can do, and more or less build that curriculum as we add into it each season and as we work with them. So there's a lot of detail there. I hope you've all managed to pick some of it up. But like I said, you can listen back to that again. But being mindful of those youth development coaches, that be realistic what you're going to ask them to do, and then just keep building on it each time.
Yeah, and a good way to think about this is actually 18% of the goals come from unopposed situations. So how do you get the balance right in your training? So it happens infrequently, but the criticism of finishing practice is unopposed and unrealistic. So how do you build your practices to be more game-like and actually stretch and challenge your players in what they'll face wherever they play the game? So we're just going to summarise this section now. Kelsey, I'll pass over to you in terms of some of these considerations for practice design and how we can help the people listening tonight.
I think just adding on to that previous point, I think, Rambo, if you think about if you get too much pressure on the ball and you're too eager, it can then become unopposed. So it's just getting that balance right, isn't it, between the mentality to go and press and win, but also not just working hard, but working smart and thinking about how I do that and when I do that and the importance of that. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight mainly just some key points from the conversation we've had so far. And I think the key points as a generalised overview are the timing of goals and the game outcome. So are we starting to think about the emphasis we put on that in practice design? More touches equals more bodies from what the data is presenting to us. So when do we allow the opposition to take more touch? When do we delay to get more bodies in? And I suppose the balancing act to that is, how do we give them too much time and therefore it just allows them the shot anyway? So it's that, how much do we delay versus how much pressure do we get on the ball? And more bodies equals less goals. So if we can get more bodies in the way, that should hopefully lead into a less opportunity to score a goal. And then the actual quality of the coverage of goal. So where are we distributing players? Are players aware of where they are on the pitch? Are they conscious around where they are on the pitch and the impact that can have on the likelihood of scoring goals? So I think that's also a really important point. So they're just the key points so far of what we've discussed, really.
Dave Clack's clearly been listening in the chat. He said with 50% direct pressure, obviously the players will then be having to change direction if the attacker was to manipulate the ball in a different direction. So again, as a coaching consideration, where do our players get opportunity to practice that type of movement where they might have to shift if the opposition were to take more than a few touches? Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've got anything to build on the back of them discussions.
And I think in just terms of your session practices is allowing them to express themselves in those ways. So we always be mindful of allowing ball mastery skills and allow them to do it within those 1v1 situations. But actually, are we allowing the defenders some rewards to it? And we'll touch into that when we go into practice design in a little bit later. But we've got to be encouraging correct defending as well. So the expressiveness of players with the ball, but also those when they haven't got it, and that transition as they win the ball back.
Superb. So now we're just going to take a look at the finalists. So we're going to take a deeper dive into the Vitality FA Cup finalists, so Man City and Everton women. And we're just going to look at some of the trends that they've shown over the last season, and then some of the considerations building up to the FA Cup final. So I've just put up the slide in terms of a sort of a summary. So how they score their goals, what percentage are from open play, how many are inside the box, the average number of attackers they get into the box when the goal is scored, how many of their assists come from crosses, and then how many are finishes first time. Any initial observations, Kelsey? The data we just put up.
I think for me would just be starting to think about, especially now we're looking at teams in particular, the individuals that these two teams have. And I know if anyone had opportunity to watch the Finishing the Attack webinar with Bev and Rianne that we did, there was a huge emphasis on Ellen White's super strength, if you like, around that first time finish. And as you can see there, that inside the box statistic. And then you're starting to think about then the average number of attackers in the box. So if you think about their shape, they utilised a 4-4-2 quite often last season, Man City. So did that allow them to get more bodies in the box on average than Everton? It would be really interesting to know where the distribution of those attackers were and how that affected the opposition in terms of being able to defend them. But I think that might come out later on in terms of where they scored goals from and where they assisted from. But they're kind of my initial thoughts, as well as obviously Man City scoring more goals than Everton quite clearly.
So it's gonna help us with the data sample. So we're gonna look at how Man City score their goals. So real key messages, the real vast 94% are inside the box, and they get considerable numbers in the box, nearly 3, and they look to build with crosses and play from wide areas that come inside the box. We'll start to show that. I know, Claire, you've got some great detail on the individuals within that. So we're just going to take it on now into actually Man City's goal scoring locations on the right hand side. And this is Everton's conceded locations. So we've flipped it. So where do Everton concede their goals? Initial observations, darker areas happens more frequently. So it's a heat map. Claire?
Yeah, so there's quite a clear pattern there, isn't there? So the defending strategy from Everton is, well, this is what we need to do. And you can see that from the practice. Again, we've got to be mindful of some of the context, from data. It's, the numbers are there, but we can delve into that a little bit later on in terms of what we're looking for. But that's a key element for us, where they tend to concede also as well. So we're looking at that right-hand side. So there's quite clear in around that 18-yard box is something that they need to do. And it's nice to have this. It'd be lovely if we all could have that as coaches. So we're mindful of that as well. But obviously, from our point of view, we're going to do it for the elite game, and this is where the practice design now comes from. And this is where we would be like what we'd be doing moving forward to kind of put these session practices together.
Kelsey, I've just highlighted some areas for you there in terms of where Man City are particularly strong and actually where Everton have conceded quite a few goals.
Yeah, I think with Man City there, we brought down the data and started to think about how many of those goals inside that second 6-yard box, if you like, were scored first time, and that was 15. And out of those 15 goals, when they scored them, they only lost the game once when they scored that first goal from that area. So it's a key area if you overlap. The Everton conceding and the Man City goal scored. Only lost one game when scoring those 15 goals from that area first time. So it's really interesting. One, their 4-4-2 shape, how they get bodies in there, the first time finishing from that area, considering their individual characteristics of the players, such as Ellen being inside those areas. None of the goals inside that 48% bracket were more than 2 touch. And the most popular shot packing was 1 or 2. It rarely got above 1 or 2 bodies across all them goals in the 48%. So whereas you think about Everton, and when we go on to their stats in a moment, they only managed to score 3 goals inside that second 6-yard box. So there's a big difference and comparison really between the two.
And I think with these coaches, have we then also been mindful that have we honestly included the goalkeeper in part of this, or we just solely looked at those outfield players? And that's something we've got to be mindful of when we start to then look at the sessions of your C design. If you solely got this yourself, would you consider that and that relationship? So it's the communication, then it's about your profile of your actual goalkeeper and what they like and dealing with them in that area, what they like in terms of their commanding, and then also that relationship to themselves and the centre halves and the other players that are in there. Just as an example from the shot packing that we had before as well. So that's something that, being honest, that do we have that link together, and we mindfulness of the session being planned with and alongside them as well.
Yeah, it's great detail, isn't it? So we'll start to build this picture up. The 9 out of them 15 were one-touch finishes. So we're saying Man City are particularly strong in those areas. We're now going to highlight how the ball gets into those locations. This is the assists. On the left-hand side, this is where Everton concede their goals from in the build-up, and this is where Man City scored those. So we've highlighted the far right channel, the inside right channel for Everton, and the same channels for Man City. So we're highlighting this could be a potential threat when we go on a head-to-head. Kelsey?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to overlay the two. And from a coaching perspective, think about the weightage and kind of how we present the week between focusing on us and what we need to be better at as a team or as a group or as individuals versus preparing to play a team. And some people watching might not need to do that because they're absolutely in the development stage and players are learning the game. Part of learning the game might be to learn to play against an opposition. But then some people who are watching tonight will also be there to play against an opposition and be in it for competitive reasons. So therefore, how much do we split up our week between us being better at what we do and us looking at ourselves versus then overlaying that and contrasting that with the opposition. I think it's always a really big question, and I don't think there's ever the right answer. It's just being considerate around, am I really conscious around doing that, or do I just do that naturally week to week?
So we're just going to build this picture up in terms of if we're in Everton's camp, so we can see they're particularly weak in some areas, and Man City particularly strong. So will that pose a threat? And if we're in their camp, preparing for this FA Cup final, how could we help them with some of the considerations we've discussed tonight? So we're just going to take it on into that. So now it's how do we apply all these numbers, all this data that players talk about that could be really useful, but we have to use it in the right way. How do we then apply that and really make impact with our players?
Yeah, and I think this is just, again, a real generalised view that can help capture it for many people. It doesn't really matter how much area size you've got, how many players you've got. It's more principle and things you can follow. But again, what we spoke about on Monday night, really simple principle, again, of just being really clear and concise on what I want to be better at, what is the session going after, what's the outcome. And I think from utilising the data, we can see that preventing first-time finishing opportunities within the 18-yard box is a clear message. And then how do I utilise some of the data and some of the things that have been presented tonight to help me overcome that? So I looked at the success criteria of 3+ bodies where possible, across the 2 6-yard box areas in particular being a focus. The spread and the quality of the shot packing, so not just bodies in the way, but the spread and the quality of those, and aiming to cover both posts between the goalkeeper and a player. So remember, the goalkeeper is part of that shot packing. And the third point of that are just being prevention of first-time finishing opportunities in lanes 2, 3 and 4. So really starting to think about preventing first-time finishing opportunities. What will that look like? Where do we want to do it? And how will the bodies and the shot packing and the quality of that shot packing help me in being able to do that? And we just start to look at some real basic, simple principles. And if you look on the right-hand side, I've tried to screenshot and capture where this fits within the whole webinar that we've discussed so far. So you can see there Man City's goal locations and how often they lost a game when they scored that first goal. The win rate when you score the first goal, the importance of the first goal. I start to think about how can we start the practice off where we're really starting to get players to consider that, but also increase the intensity. And I know there was a question in the chat box about increasing that intensity early doors. So a little bit of a small-sided game. If you score the first goal, you get 2 points. So it's worth 2 goals. So therefore, there's a real emphasis on scoring that first goal, but also defending it, not allowing that first goal to go in. It's the risk versus reward around how eager are we to score that first goal versus how eager are we to defend it. If you score the first goal, or if you score a goal at all within the highlighted box, which we can highlight that with flat markers, which would represent the red box there on the image on the right-hand side, that second 6-yard box, if you can score within that, again, it equals 2 goals. And a little bit of a challenge could be, if you score the first goal, how will you manage the game to ensure that you win it by the end? So that, okay, you don't just score the first goal, they get 2, but then the opposition score 4, and you lose a game 4-2. You're starting to think about then the defending aspects, the management of the game, how you bring that into the context of the game, and ensuring that if you do score that first goal, you hold out to win. So that was just a few considerations of utilising that first tactical part of the data we discussed.
And I just add to that as well. The discussion earlier in terms of if your players are allowed to understand and notice more, this is a real good way to link that together, because you're highlighting key areas and key aspects within the session, and then they can then see that if they've got the opportunity of video or some analysis from peers or themselves, then they can start to link this together and go, actually, I'm doing it for this reason. Start to build that picture up there. So I think it's really good in terms of that. Yeah, absolutely. And then the second part of that is just starting to think about maybe a little part practice to start to unpick this a little bit further. And again, it could be 2 18-yard boxes back to back, a little condensed practice.
lots of bodies, lots of things going on, replicating the picture that we seen earlier in the webinar around the shot packing picture. Bodies in the way, lots of bodies in a small vicinity. One, that gets out the quality of the finish, but two, obviously starts to think about that shot packing, the pressure, where we're applying pressure, how we're applying pressure, what it looks like. But again, just a real simple consideration could be you get 5 points for a goal, but for every body that's in the way when you score the goal, that gets taken away. So, for example, start with 5. If there's 3 bodies in the way, you end up then just with 2 goals. So it's an emphasis of the defenders to try and get in the way of the goal, try and shoot back. If you block the shot, you then take them 2 goals off them, or you take the 5 goals off them, however you want to manage that as a coach. And then there could be a progression or a consideration around if them goals are scored on a first time finish, then it doubles. So that 2 points that I was going to get now gives me 4 because it was a first time finish. So then I'm starting to really emphasise that first time finish, getting pressure on early. How do I get pressure on? What does that look like? How do I utilise my body? When do I make body contact? How do I make body contact to prevent all those things from happening? So again, how it links, just if you look at Everton's goal locations and around where them goals are scored, and then the success criteria I set out for at the beginning, I think that these couple of points and considerations may help to get some of them 3 points out. And then the second or the last part of the practice was just trying to tie that all together in more of a tactical perspective and a larger practice. Was then starting to consider where are the ball coming from. So the first 2 practices were very much around the actual application of defending in and around that emergency defending in and around the box. But now it's how are balls getting into the box, how are balls getting into them areas, how do we stop those in its instance, how do we stop the build-up, where do runs and recovery runs look like in the build-up. So now I'm starting to think about a bigger practice and looking at the areas in which Man City score from and assist from. You can see there I've highlighted assists from deep, assists from, and there's quite a heavy percentage on one side. So if I was thinking that I don't have that many bodies, not many players have shown up tonight, don't have that much area size, could it be that I shift that way and we just do a bit of a function down one side? So if I know that one team is predominantly successful down one side, I might just shift the practice down that side. And then just thinking about some considerations, how am I going to manage the opposition to get out some realistic and relevant pictures? How can I ensure the service come from some key areas? So again, having a real emphasis around deep. How will I utilise either players, staff, feeders from them deeper areas to try and get some assists from them zones and longer passes? And am I going to consider the depth and the space I have in behind to allow me to do that? How can I reinforce some key messages from practice 1 and 2? So that real intent to win, intent to spoil, intent to prevent. How many bodies do we win? What pressure do we want to look like? Where will we put pressure on? Where is it important to get those bodies? And what are the players' needs from across the 4 corners? So if this is the performance problem I want to solve, the problems are balls coming in from that right-hand side predominantly. If you're looking at that left-hand side in a channel, players getting inside there, that maybe inverted wingers that Claire spoke about earlier, getting inside and combining. How am I going to help players solve the problem of preventing goals from there? What can I do? What constraints can I put on? What challenges can I put on? What individual technical and tactical requirements and conversations do I need to have with certain players? And these are all the different things that we can't answer because we don't know the players. But just, again, some things to consider around what that might look like for your players in particular. And Claire, I don't know if you've got anything to add on in terms of all them 3 practices and any key messages or key thoughts from hearing those back.
I think just from the whole planning process, wasn't it? It was just painting the pictures of the problems that may happen, and our job is then to help them solve it and or let them solve it in a way that they will see. And there's a real social element that runs through as well. So going back to that 4 corners issue, we have to consider all the 4 there. And like we said, it just goes back down to, we can't answer is it going to be a 4? Is it going to be 2? Is it like all the unitary wise? But knowing your players, knowing who they are, knowing what they've got, and then what your priorities would then be is just answering the questions from just the data that's been given. So we're just giving you some complementary ideas and session ideas. And again, with what you've got, what could you do? And it's just an example of something that would be put together that's been quite patterned in a way to kind of look to solve some of them issues and problems that could and should arise from the previous data we've just been given.
Yeah, and again, it's quite generic because we don't know if you play with back 3, back 5, back 4, what your priority areas would be, what your left back even looks like. You might have a really good left back, therefore that then 11 and 18% down there might not be an issue. It might be that right hand side, that 18% where they're cutting in, that might be the issue. Your right hand sided centre half, your right back. So all these different things are the problems that we can't solve, but what we can do is just start to give you some considerations to think about, and some ways in which we can start to apply that to your own players, the teams you play against, and how and where your players compete. Is it developmental, and I need to give them and serve up a variety of all these things? Or is it competitive and I'm out there to win, and therefore we've got a real key focus around an opposition and what the opposition might look like?
And hopefully we've sort of modelled this best practice of taking insight and data and actually trying to enhance practice then. So to give your players lots of opportunities to experience what might come in the game. So we can only make predictions that are informed to the best of our ability, and that's what we've tried to do for this in the build-up to the Women's FA Cup. And Martin summed it up perfectly in the chat that these practices have got to suit you, your players, and your context. So you can't just take them, just put them in copy and paste job. It's got to be actually take these principles and put them in your work. So we're just going to look at some other sort of considerations that fell out of the data that might happen in this game. So we're just going to take it on now in terms of actually where does possession start? So do you give consideration to actually where possession starts within this attacking third?
Yeah, and I think just being mindful of that starting position. So is it where, wrongly we always it's a coach playing it in or a set piece, but actually it's a transition, and we either lost or we've just regained the ball. So I think it's just important there just to be mindful of that. If this is where possession starts from, but actually, can the sessions do that as well? So it becomes realistic in the pictures of what we're painting for players and ourselves to work with as well.
Yeah, and I think another one to this as well, and something that we unpicked when we looked at the data, was when goals were scored when teams went down to 10 men, and what that looked like. How much effect did it have on the game? Did it affect the opposition's style and what that looked like? So we start to think about it from a tactical perspective as well. And this in particular was a key standout for me. And around 10 players, and it could be an in possession, but obviously today we'll focus on the out possession. But what would your defending strategy look like if you went down to 10 players? And on average, a team within the WSL went down to 10 men for 33 minutes. And that's quite a considerable amount of time, really. So how often do we practice that in sessions? Do we give enough time to that? The players know 10 men, 10 players. And also we start to think about then what constraints can we put on the practice? If I've got an odd number in a, do we put a floater in? Do we put someone in a coloured bib that says, right, you play for both teams? Or actually, are we quite comfortable in playing different numbers? Are we quite comfortable with setting this up intentionally? And it would just be a thought process to you as a coach, really, to think about, what does this look like for my players? Do I give them opportunity to practice that? Would they be able to solve the problem? What would they do? What would be their thought if you went down to 10 players? What would they like to do? What priority areas then would you defend? As well as starting to think about your in-possession strategy that has to supplement that and go together, would be then how are you planning on keeping the ball? Because there was instances within the WSL where a team did go down to 10 players, scored additional goals and ended up winning the game. So, it's not just a negative aspect. It's starting to think about the mindset and the psychological mindset of what happens to your players, but also the opposition. And do we practice that enough? I think is a consideration. And then just linking onto this, really, just to kind of summarise everything in one, and we've gone through the first 4 in particular, and the first 4 key messages quite early on in the webinar. But just to recap some of those in terms of the timings of the goal and the outcome, how often do we consider that? More touches equals more bodies, and more bodies hopefully will equal less goals from what the data is telling us. Goal coverage and the quality, what does that look like? And are we considering the goalkeeper within that? When we speak about direct and indirect and unopposed opportunities for players on the ball, but also defenders, how could we start the practice? So exactly how Claire alluded to there with that slide is, do we start practices from throw-ins enough? Do we start practices from transitions enough? What does all the above then look like when we start a practice looking like that? And how can we apply it to different game challenges and different problems? How can we set the players' problems and challenges to overcome? Do we throw in different things enough? Do we throw in a little bit of a change in formation? So, okay, they were playing against a 4-4-2 and there's 2 strikers, but now I'm going to give you 3. Or, I was going to give you 1 or 3, but now I'm going to say that the wide players are going to invert and they're going to come inside. Or now I'm going to say I'm going to give you 2 strikers this time, to think about how do you apply all the above and everything we've spoke about to a bit of a different challenge and a problem. And how often do we serve up these different challenges to the players to actually give them a variety of applying the principles of defending, but across different contexts. So we 1-0 up. What does that now look like? You 1-0 down. What does that now look like? Because now sitting behind the ball and being quite patient might not be able to happen anymore. We might need to go and chase the game. It might be over 2 legs, so we might be quite happy to lose 1-0 away from home. So there's all these different things that we need to consider, and how often do we put the players into those different contexts and provide them challenges to really get them to think about how they're applying all this technical and tactical information, but to completely different contexts. Claire, have you got anything to add on to that?
Yeah, it's just the add-on to a cup final, isn't it? So this is something that's obviously this is built around that. Actually, to play a cup final is completely different to that to a league game. So, that context within itself, the game must be won in that day, in that game, and that time. So that's something that considerations, do we practice that enough? And do we allow players to have those experiences from being the goalkeeper, from in particular in terms of like what happens if it is drawn and the penalty situation? That's something we're not even touched on yet. And I know that's something that the data, we're mindful of, that's what we're bringing things from. But these are the considerations that, we have to allow players that they'll not know the answers unless we've given them the problems to help them provide the solutions. And when is the best time in our practices? So those game scenarios are really valuable and important.
Yeah, so hopefully we've whetted the appetite, give you some considerations to experiment with your players and try things and reflect and see what works and what doesn't, and just constantly keep trying to improve that way. So just to sort of summarise, we've got another session on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, the 28th of October at 6 o'clock. We're going to look at Esme Morgan's development from playgrounds to Wembley. So it should be great insight from Esme and the coach developers in and around that. So please sign up for that on Wednesday, and then we'll also review the FA Cup final once the game's been played a week on Saturday, and that will complete our 4-part series on this. Just before we wrap up, I was going to hand over to Claire and just some of the ongoing support in the women's game.
Yeah, so you've obviously got some great insight there. That's women's game specific, and it's something that's we've been needing for some time now. So if you're wanting some support, these are the officers like yourself. So there was ourselves here. So Kelsey from the National Coach Developers. There's 4. There's 10 of us in the Women's High Performance Centres, which are based around the universities around the country, and those 8 FA Women's and Girls Coach Development Officers. And you're more than welcome to come and provide and be given that support. Go to the boot room, have a look. The contacts will be there. I'm more than mindful of it, and it's great to have that insight into female specific understanding of the game and having the contact with ourselves and yourselves from either being from the chat and obviously Martin, who's been on there as well. Some great questions that have been coming out, and from you guys that really want to be included and understand about the game and being specific with what it is. But it was been really enjoyable tonight to be on this call as well with it and being involved with the people here, and hopefully you guys will connect with ourselves and everyone, and we can look forward to on the next webinar. I'll be logging in to watch that one on Esme. So
just to summarise, Martin's challenge to the FA Cup final is watch the Women's FA Cup final as a coach, not a fan. Analyse the shots on goal, look at the areas they come from, the packing, the positioning, everything we discussed tonight, and really try to decipher the team's strategy, see if you can see some of the themes we've talked about tonight and see actually what unfolds in the game. So all that's left for me to say is a huge thank you to Kelsey, to Claire, to Martin, to Laura in the background. I hope you've taken a lot away from tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.